Most American citizens take the right to vote to contribute to democracy for granted. It was not always this way. Before "We the People" was interpreted as being for both men and women, before the 19th Amendment, there was the women's suffrage movement. But what role did Tennessee play in women's suffrage? The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. These 28 words, which seem unnecessary today, were controversial and highly polarizing when added to the U.S. Constitution in 1920. As Elaine Weiss explains, the controversy over ratification of the 19th Amendment, and, more broadly, the long battle over women's suffrage, wasn't simply a political argument. It was also a social, cultural, and moral debate, a precursor to what we now call culture wars, raising issues that were complex and divisive. These words represented the finish line of a 72-year marathon that formally began with the Women's Rights Convention held in Seneca Falls, New York, in July of 1848, and would not be finished until August 21st, 1920, in Nashville, Tennessee. Originally introduced into the United States Congress in 1878, it took 41 years for Congress to find the political will to approve the proposed amendment, which it did on June 4th, 1919, and handed it off to the states for consideration.
The South had been solidly anti-suffragist, and by the summer of 1920, the suffragists had 35 of the 36 state ratifications that they needed, and then it started failing in the North. The governor of Vermont would not call a special session. It failed in Ohio. It failed in New Jersey. Places they had hoped that it would pass rejected it, and they were desperate to try to get something done before the election. They chose Tennessee.
Suffragist and anti-suffragist forces began to descend upon Nashville. Among the suffragists was Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the preeminent suffrage organization in the nation, the National American Women's Suffrage Association.
She came here expecting to stay for a weekend for the ratification vote, and it turned into much, much longer than that. And she graciously allowed the Tennessee suffragists to handle the battle in Nashville, because the Tennessee suffragists knew that there were still enough hard feelings between the North and the South that if Northern women came down to lobby the men in the legislature, they could not be as effective as Southern women. And so she agreed to take a back seat. And so from her hotel room, she marshaled the troops and planned the strategy and worked hard, but she basically let the Tennessee suffragists take the lead.
Catt worked with Susan B. Anthony as the national organizer of suffrage campaigns. Other notables working closely with Catt were Anne Dallas Dudley, founder of the Nashville Equal Suffrage League, Catherine Kenny, and Abby Crawford Milton, leader of the Tennessee League of Women Voters. The National Women's Suffrage Party, the other major national suffrage organization, was also well represented in Nashville during the weeks leading up to the special session.
Susan B. Anthony died 14 years before the amendment passed, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had already passed at that time. So there was sort of a void in the leadership, and they had focused on being nonviolent. They had focused on trying to persuade people logically to do the right thing. And honestly, that can only take you so far. And so that's where the rift came between the National Women's Party and the main suffrage group.
Regarded as the more radical of the two associations, the group splintered off from the NAWSA over a disagreement in strategy and tactics. On the other side of the issue, the women working to oppose ratification, informally known as the Aunties, were led by Josephine Pearson. In addition to ministers, politicians, and educators, the Aunties were joined in opposition to ratification by the whiskey lobby, which was concerned that if given the vote, women would demand actual enforcement of prohibition, the manufacturing lobby, which feared that women might pass worker protection laws and might seek to outlaw child labor, and the railroad lobby, led by the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, which offered state legislators free passes with the understanding that the legislature would not interfere with the railroads. One common plea held that the proposed amendment was a threat to the American way of life.
There were women who opposed suffrage, I think mostly out of fear, because they were so dependent financially on their husbands and fathers, and they were afraid that if they were seen as a ruffian wanting independence, that they might wind up having to support themselves, and women couldn't get decent jobs then. They even couldn't participate in many places in public education. That was closed to them. So they were really afraid of an upheaval in the social world that would leave them without any means to support themselves. A lot of businesses opposed suffrage because they were afraid they might have to pay better wages, that women would ask for equal pay, and that they might have to hire women when they really didn't want to have to hire women. So, a lot of fear.
Clinging to the cult of domesticity that held a woman's place within the home, women were meant to tend to domestic chores and raise children, and were not suited to business and politics. The Anthony Amendment was a challenge to the prevailing gender roles and was a threat to marriage and family. And so, on Monday, August 9th, 1920, the special session of the Tennessee legislature commenced. On the second day of the session, resolutions recommending the ratification of the 19th Amendment were submitted in both chambers. From the beginning, it was clear that the future of the amendment would rest principally in the hands of the House. On the evening of the very first day of the special session, the Speaker of the House, Seth Walker, informed Carrie Chapman Catt that he could not vote for the resolution. By the very next morning, Walker had announced that he would lead the opposition and would use whatever powers he could as a speaker to defeat the amendment. On Tuesday, August 17th, the Antis successfully brought the debate on the floor of the House to a close. Having seen some legislators switch from support to opposition, later that night, Carrie Chapman Catt told her colleagues, "There is one thing more we can do. Only one. We can pray." At the start of the session on Wednesday, August 18th, the House was packed like it had never been. At the end of the debate, Seth Walker shouted, "The hour has come. The battle has been fought and won," and moved to table the resolution, which would essentially end the House's consideration of the amendment for the session and possibly for good. The clerk finished the roll call vote and announced 48 ayes and 48 nays. Without a majority, the motion to table would be defeated. Not wanting to accept the outcome, Walker demanded a second roll call. Once again, the vote was 48 to 48, and the motion died. With a tied vote on the motion, there would likely not be a majority support for ratification. So, immediately he called for a vote to concur with Senate Joint Resolution No. 1. A 24-year-old freshman delegate from Neoda, Tennessee, Harry T. Byrne, heard his name called. He had cast every vote during the special session along with the anti-suffrage coalition. Earlier that day, a letter had been delivered to him on the House floor. It was from his mother.
Bev Byrne had been a teacher. She read in the newspaper a speech by Senator Kanzler just shortly before the vote was taken in Nashville, in which he just said horrible things about Carrie Chapman Catt and called her names and ridiculed her, and just a vicious speech, and it made her mad. It made her so mad that she sat down and she wrote a long letter to Harry. She wanted him to be a good boy and vote for suffrage. And so when the roll call came to him, he switched sides and voted for suffrage. Suffrage would have lost, but for him switching sides.
On Tuesday, August 24th, Tennessee Governor Albert Roberts signed the certificate of ratification and sent it by registered mail to the U.S. Secretary of State. Suffragists stood around Roberts and watched him sign the certification. Women's suffrage was safely a part of the U.S. Constitution. So what role did Tennessee play in women's suffrage? Tennessee played a critical role in women gaining the right to vote in the United States in 1920. Without Tennessee, the 19th Amendment would not have been ratified, and the movement for women's rights would have been at a stalemate. Tennessee was neither a protagonist or an antagonist in this story, because within Tennessee, there were many different people with many different perspectives. All gaining votes for women was accomplished. Achieving true equality requires that women exercise these votes. As Carrie Chapman Catt wrote after ratification, the vote is emblematic of your equality, women of America, the guarantee of your liberty. That vote of yours has cost millions of dollars in the lives of thousands of women. Women have suffered agony of soul which you never can comprehend, and that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it.